One of the dangers of evaluating pieces of audio equipment, and particularly audio quote-unquote accessories like cables, footers, spikes, isolators, whatever, power conditioners, etc., is something called expectation bias. And it's really, really detrimental if you're involved in designing audio products. And I'll explain exactly what I mean there. If you go out and, you save your hard-earned pennies to go out and buy, some expensive interconnect cable, let's say to go from your CD player to your preamplifier or your processor. Let's say that these are not inexpensive. So, like $400 or $500 interconnect cables, which is, not even expensive these days in terms of where you can go in the marketplace. If you've scrimped and saved to buy those cables, you bring them home, you plug them in, you connect your CD player, and maybe you listen to it with the original cables in place first, plug the new ones in. They're going to have probably beautiful, shiny connectors with no tarnish on them, no wear. You plug everything in, you sit back and listen and marvel at the change and the improvement that's been wrought by those cables. The problem is that your brain there's an expectation bias. You've changed something. You put in something that you think is going to be better, obviously, because otherwise you wouldn't have bought it. You've had to maybe save your money for some time to get it. So you're a little bit excited about finally being able to buy those whatever that component or that accessory is. And the problem is that expectation bias automatically means that you are more likely to hear an improvement, find an improvement, say that there's something there that may actually not be there. Now, I'm not going to go into the can of worms of, whether something like cables or power conditioners or power cables can sound any different. Whatever you hear is what you hear. Just pay some attention and realize that there are things going on psychologically in your head that are impacting what you're hearing, what your perception is going to be. Now, I mentioned why this is a huge detriment to people that design equipment, and it doesn't matter whether it's loudspeakers or whatever, and it's one of the reasons that we perform blind listening tests. Now, this is another can of worms because people make the assumption that, it's an unnatural environment, you're stressed. There's all kinds of people that have written, non-scientific papers on the topic. The reality is that if you cannot see and you do not know what's going on, what you're listening to, what's been changed, etc., there is no expectation bias. If you have now two components, let's say two identical power amplifiers, except one has had some small difference in the circuitry on one of those amplifiers, but not only do you not know that there's a difference between the amplifiers, maybe you don't even know that you're comparing two amplifiers. So there is no expectation bias. You don't know what has been changed, what the differences are, and you don't even know whether you're switching between two amplifiers when you're performing a listening test. And this is why blind listening is really critical for design. I know many people argue that, it's completely wrong because it's not how you normally will listen to something. You should live with it for a while. But remember, we're talking about trying to discern very, very fine differences, very minute changes in many cases that you have to get that bias out of the way. Otherwise, you are now suffering that expectation bias. I'll give you one simple example. If I'm designing, let's say, a new crossover for a bookshelf speaker, and I've spent, let's say, weeks getting the measurements just perfect, and now I have the old version of the same speaker or a similar speaker there, and I set them up and I sit down and compare them, well, the one that I've been working on so hard is the one that I'm going to find better, particularly if I know that the measurements should characterize a better sounding speaker than the previous model. That's always going to happen. And as much as, I might want to fool myself into thinking, well, I can I can be critical and I'm not going to fall into that trap. It's extremely difficult. So just be careful. Just watch for that. Make sure that component change that you're making, that accessory that you're purchasing, try and do some research. Try and maybe even borrow the product you're looking at and have someone else in the household swap it out unknown to you. You could do some maybe silly looking things like listen blindfolded to try and get rid of that expectation bias. But just always remember that it is there. Take your car into the shop and have a tune-up. Guess what? The thing's going to drive better. You're going to think the performance is better, the acceleration is smoother, all that, if you just went and you spent a pile of money having a tune-up done on your engine. So just remember that. I'd love to hear your comments. Have you fallen into that sort of trap where, you bought some expensive component or accessory, put it in your system, found it made a huge difference the day that you bought it, and then weeks later you start questioning, was that even an improvement? I'd love to hear your comments, and thank you very much as always for watching.